So to start, we're going to first of all go to our VS Code right here, and the first thing we're going to do is to first of all create a single file called the docker-compose.yaml file. So the docker-compose.yaml file is a single file that Docker Compose will use to build a complex setup of all the containers that we're going to be running together. It will define things such as the services, which are the containers themselves. It will then also specify things like the networks. So networks are custom networks that are going to enable these containers to talk to each other, just like we're going to see. It will also define volumes, which are going to be folders on our host file system, which is our Windows file system in this case, that will enable Docker to persist some things. For example, if we set up a PostgreSQL database, we shall need some way of backing up that data. Even when we destroy the containers or delete the images, we may need some way to back up our files. So that's what volumes are. So to start, we're going to go ahead and create that file inside our root folder right here. I'll create that with docker-compose.yaml or YAML. And once that is done, we shall then go ahead and define our stuff inside this file. Now, one thing to note is there are three components to a Docker Compose YAML file, and those are services. So each is mapped just like you can have a Python dictionary, you have keys and values, but a key is going to always be like this, and then you provide a colon, then you provide values, but those values will be either on your right or they'll be nested, just like you can have a nested dictionary inside a dictionary. So this is YAML, and it's a language that is a superset of JSON. So you can also set this up in terms of JSON and tell Docker to, or Docker Compose to run the services by use of a JSON file, but that's not what we're going to do. So just like I was explaining, services are the first thing you have to define. Then you also have to define networks. So you're also going to define volumes. So our services are going to be the containers that will be running within our Docker Compose setup. Now, those are things that we've defined inside our demo.txt file right here, including our app, our database, the Celery worker, Redis, and then Flower to monitor our Celery workers. So for us to be in position to set those up, we need to define them under services. So we may have something like app, or let's say Django app, and then we may have something like DB or PostgreSQL DB, and then you may have something like Redis, then you may have something like Flower, and maybe the Celery workers. So these are the services that we're going to be demonstrating in this video. So Django app is going to be our Django app, which we've already defined using our Docker file inside here. We're also going to be having another Docker file for the Celery workers, but most of the other things like Flower, Redis, and Postgres are going to be images external to our setup, so we may just pull them and run them as containers. So let's start by defining the setup for our Django application, followed by the PostgreSQL database. But before we do that, we need to first of all set up our application to make use of a setup that will allow us to use Postgres. So let me go back to our file right here. I'm just going to go and open the settings.py file. So I'll do that with Ctrl and E, then search for settings.py. Now inside settings.py is the different configurations. So we're going to be changing something so that we can read them from environment variables. I'm going to start with our databases section right here and point this to Postgres. Maybe also set up SQLite as a default option. So I'll create a boolean called use Postgres or use PG, and then this will be reading from our environment variables. So I'm going to be using a package called OS, or a library called OS inside our Python standard library that's going to enable us to read those environment variables. So I'll say import OS, but since we installed python.env, I'll also make use of that. So that's exactly what's going to read our environment file or our env file. So in this case, we shall say from .env import load.env, sorry for that. And then we'll have to call this file or call this specific function. So calling this specific function will give us the ability to read an environment variable file. But for us to access the values of that environment variable file, we'll then have to use os.getEnv. So getEnv will allow us to read the value from the env file with a key. So in this case, we can basically set something like use pg as an environment variable, and then we can create a boolean that checks if that is equal to true. So we can even make this interesting by specifying .lower because we want that to be lowercase and we can equate it to true. Now we can also specify defaults in here. So if the key is not found, we can specify a default by using this second argument, which we can then add as false. So by doing this, we've set up our use PostgreSQL flag. Now, once we've done that, we can also go ahead and use that. So we can say use PG. If use PG, then we can go ahead and use PG. So I'll pass this for now. Else, we can use our default database, which is SQLite. So what I'm going to be doing is making use of a tool called the database URLs or the Django database URLs, which helps us to use database URLs instead of the default. It helps us use database URLs instead of the default dictionary that we have right here. So to set this up, I'm going to go ahead and also, first of all, create the databases dictionary as an empty dictionary. And then I'll just go ahead and modify this code right here to make use of the databases dictionary. So I'll say databases default is going to be equal to this dictionary that we have right here. I'll format that to look a little bit better. So I'll just come right in here. And then that will be fixed. So databases default will be equal to this for that case where we do not have PostgreSQL set up. So for us to have PostgreSQL set up, I'll have to first of all add the DJ database URLs, which I actually forgot to install, but that's going to be installed by using pip install DJ database URL. So that will install that tool. Then we'll have to raise it to our requirements. So txt. And once that is done, we'll then go ahead and import it at the top. So I'll go to the top right here, and then I'll import DJ database URL. So that we can then specify the databases default to be the DJ database URL. So databases default in this case is going to be DJ database URL dot config, and for our case we shall provide the. So what you're going to be doing is to specify the default URL. So in this case, that's going to be equal to our PostgreSQL URL. Now I'm going to go ahead and also add that here. So I'll say that our DB URL is going to be equal to os.getEnv, and in this case we shall provide database URL. Now keep in mind that we're going to be working with a docker-compose kind of setup. So all these environment variables have to be present before we actually go ahead and build the setup. So we're going to come in here and provide our default as the DB URL. Now we can also provide others if we can provide the con max age, which is going to be the maximum amount of time we should wait before we create a connection. So if this time delays, then we can at least stop connecting. So yeah, once we have set that up, we have now created our database URL or our database settings. We can also go ahead and change debug to true or false from an environment variable. So we can do something like os.getEnv. Then here we can go ahead and create maybe a development environment variable, and then we can specify the value to be false as the default. Then we can check if that is equal to true. So when you provide true in our environment variable, that is when our debug value will be equal to true. So this is going to actually be development. So once this is done, now let's create the env file. I'm going to come right here, and then I'll add that file, which is going to be our .env. So inside our .env, we're going to start with our development. So I'll copy this key right here, go here, and paste it. So development is going to be equal to true. So that will be our debug equals true. So that means that in case the server starts and checks, it will then see this to be true. Therefore, it will run the app with debug mode on. But in case it runs it with false, or if we don't specify that key, then we'll have to run with debug false. Then allowed hosts is empty. Let's go ahead and set up our database settings. So we're going to have use Postgres. I'll set that up here with use pg equals true. So we set this up to be true because we want to use our PostgreSQL database. Then we're going to set up the database URL. So I'll have to copy this, and then I'll have to paste it right here. So since we're going to be working within our Docker Compose setup, I think we should first of all set that up before we actually look at this URL. So I'll go back to our Docker Compose YAML. I'll comment this out for now, and we shall concentrate on the Django app and our database. So to start, we're going to begin with our Django app. So the first thing we have to do is to tell Docker how to build the container, or how to build the image before it runs the container for our Django app. So we need to provide build, which is basically going to list all the details about how we're going to build the image. So in that case, we have to specify the context where everything is going to be built from. So that's going to be within our root folder. And then you have to point to a Docker file. So this is going to work in case we need to build our images from Docker files that we have inside here. But we can also do something like Docker. We can just say image and then point to an image. That's if the image exists on our Docker setup on our machine. So I'll remove this, but the Docker file that we need to use in this case is going to be found inside Docker files /app and then /docker file. Then you need to specify the ports on which our app is going to run. So build is the details of the building of the images. Then ports is going to specify which ports the app is going to run on. Now remember the command we ran at first, which was responsible for running the Docker. That's exactly what we're going to be using. So I'm going to be copying that port mapping, and then I'll add that. So what this means is that port 8004 of the Docker container will be mapped onto port 8004 of our local machine so that we can access it on localhost. Once that is done, now we're going to go ahead and also specify the networks on which our app is going to run. So I'll do networks, and then I'll run or provide the network name. So this is going to be our app network. And since these are going to be running within the same networks, we're actually going to be using the same names of the services we provided to help them communicate or to work with each other. So when we provide the name of the network, app network, we then need to go ahead and also add that to our networks. So I'll come right here, provide the app network. So this is going to be a mapping out here. So this is like the global config. So if we need to specify some app network features, we need to do them right here. But I'm going to leave it like the way you see it down here. So the next thing we're going to do is to specify which containers or which services the Django app is going to depend on. Now, for this case, we're only going to depend on the PostgreSQL database. So I'll say depends -on and shall list all the services it depends on. So for our case, that's going to be the DB service, which is going to be our PostgreSQL service. And that, I think, is what we need. Now, the next thing we may also define the volumes, because we may want to maybe persist the code outside the container file system, in that if we delete the containers, we can still remain with our files as we created them. So what we need to do is to specify a name of a volume. So I may call this, let me just call it dot, and then I specify where that code is going to be. So that's going to be located inside the app folder or the /app folder right here. All right, now that we've been able to set up the configuration for our Django app, let's go ahead and now set up our PostgreSQL. So to set up our PostgreSQL database, we're going to be making use of the official Postgres image that is found on Docker-Hub. Now, in case you want to use external images, it's always important that you go to the documentation of those images so that you can understand how they set up. So this is the official page or the official Docker-Hub repo for Docker Postgres, and therefore we are going to be making use of this to set up our service. Now, the first thing we need to understand is the name of the image, which is going to be Postgres, but we also need to specify which tag or which specific version we need. So if we need to build from that image, we are then going to go ahead and specify that within our docker-compose file by just using the image key. And then the value of that will be the name of the image, which is for our case Postgres, and then the name of the tag. So for our case, we need to specify any of the provided tags right here. But I'm going to be providing the 17 Alpine because Alpine images are known for their small size, and therefore we can build containers that are not that big or images that are not big. So if I go back here, I can then go ahead and provide 17-Alpine, and that will be the name of the image we shall use for our service, which is our PostgreSQL service. So as the image has been pulled, we shall need to have some environment variables set up. But before we do that, let us go ahead and set up the ports on which this is going to run. Now, we all understand that PostgreSQL runs on the default port 5432, but we need to still map that onto the 5432 of our host machine. For us to do that, we're going to do 5432 mapped onto 5432 of the host machine, just like we did for our application or our Django app right here. So just like you see, we specified 8004 to 8004 of our host machine, and that's exactly what we are going to be doing for our PostgreSQL app. So once that is done, now let's define our environment variables. So PostgreSQL requires one mandatory environment variable, and that's going to be the Postgres password environment variable. Now, depending on what you want to do, you can hard code it in here, but what we're going to be doing is to read this from an environment variable. Docker Compose uses this syntax, $ brackets, and then the name of the environment variable to allow you to read environment variables. So in this case, what we can do is to provide the name of the environment variable inside this right here, and then we'll have to add this to our .env. So what I'm going to do is to go down here or go up here, and then I'll provide the Postgres password. So I'll say this is going to be our test pass 123. So this is going to be the password that the Postgres user is going to be making use of to access Postgres. So we can also set up the Postgres user by just coming right here and saying Postgres underscore user. We shall use the same syntax, so we shall use $ brackets and then provide the PostgreSQL user. And then we can also provide a default database that we can use inside Postgres. So I can come here, provide that, and then this is going to be the Postgres DB. And just like that, these are the settings we need to add to our environment file. So I'll just copy this, go back to our environment file, add them right here, and then I'll provide values for them. So our Postgres user, let's just call that our test user. Oh, I can even keep it to my name. And then the Postgres DB for this case can be something that has to do with test DB. So once that is done, we can then proceed to use our database URL. So to use our database URL, we can create a database URL in normal PostgreSQL database URL that will have values like PostgreSQL and then the user. So in this case, we have provide the user, then we provide the password. Sorry for that. Can provide the password. And then the host. So we have to provide the value of the host. And then we have to provide the database. So this is going to be the database. Now let's go ahead and add the values for this. So our user in this case is going to be the user for the PostgreSQL database we are setting up here. So that's going to be our user, JOD35, or my name. And then we shall add the password. So our password in this case is going to be the test pass we've set up right here. And then the host in that case will refer to the service that's going to be the one to provide Postgres to us. Now in this case, we've named that DB. So that's the name of the container. So that's the whole point of networking, that these containers will communicate to each other. And instead of pointing to the image IDs or the container IDs, this time we have a name that we can finally use to access that service. So in this case, we'll just have to point to DB, and then the name of the database is going to be what we've set up here, which is the default database test DB. And that will be it. So we have PostgreSQL, user, password, the host, and then the database. So once that is done, let's go ahead and now test our things. But one important thing that we've actually forgotten to set up within our DB service is going to be the volumes. So just like I explained, volumes are folders or directories that enable us to have some persistence. This is very important in a way that there are some components to your Docker Compose setup that are going to need some persistence. For example, your database. You don't want to lose data each time you destroy your containers or each time you stop your services from running. So these volumes are going to be external to the container file system that Docker provides. And that is actually useful because you can use them to back up your service or to back up the data that you needed with the service. So for our case, I'll just come right here and say volumes, and then we'll provide the name of the volume just like we did for the app. So in this case, we'll have to provide the name of the volume. I'll call this PG data, and then I'll provide the folder external to our Docker or our Docker Compose setup that's going to be used. So Postgres always keeps its data in var lib PostgreSQL /data. So that's going to be the name of the folder in which PostgreSQL will keep its data external to the container. So we need to register that. And to do that, we have to just come right here inside volumes, just like we did for networks. And we add that just like we've done right there. Now, let's go ahead and test this up. Now, the beauty about Docker Compose is that we can define all that complex stuff right in here, but we can have one command to run all the containers or services. So we need to go to our PowerShell right here, and then we can do something like docker compose app. So this is the command that will start all the services. Now, there's one thing that I see as a warning right here. Postgres user is not set, PostgreSDB is not set. So let me go ahead and check if we've defined those. We've defined Postgres user and PostgreSDB. I wonder why those are not read. I don't know if those are being read because I'm seeing Postgres user. So this is Postgres. I think I made a mistake in how I named them. So inside that Docker Compose, I missed a G. So this is going to be Postgres, and this will be Postgres. Then I'll have to do the same thing here. So always keep in mind that those mistakes are going to happen, and you need to be careful not to introduce them to your services. So this is going to be Postgres, password, Postgres user, PostgreSDB. And just like I defined them here, that's how Docker will read them. So if we go back here and try to set up the entire setup, Postgres password, I wonder what happened there. So we have Postgres password, and then we have Postgres password. So that's the silly mistake I had done. But once that is fixed, we can run our Docker Compose app, and now it will build the entire services or the entire setup. And I think this will be faster depending on how the internet is, and if you have the image locally, it will even be much faster. So let's wait for this to get done and we'll be back. All right, now that our setup is running, we now can see that we've set up our PostgreSQL. It has gone ahead and installed the PostgreSQL installation. Just like you see right here, it set up the directory valid Postgres data, created subdirectories, all that stuff. Postgres has been installed. We are good to go. Now, one other thing we need to check, our database server has actually been started and the database has been created. So everything has been running smoothly. And now we also have our server running. So these are running together within the single network. Now, one thing we can do is to now go ahead and try to navigate to that, because we need to be in the same folder where our Docker Compose file is. So in this case, if I run docker compose es, this time we'll see our two containers, the DB and the Django app running. And that means we can now run the commands. So in this case, we can run docker compose, sorry for this mistake. So this is going to be docker compose logs, and then we can point to a service just like DB. So that will show us the PostgreSQL logs. And now we can also show the logs for, let's say, our app, and that's which we called actually Django app. So compose logs will show us the Django app, and this is exactly what we shall see. All right, so that is basically what is happening right here. We are logging logs for our Django app, and we are logging logs for our database. So those are the two services we've so far defined. Now you can also do important things such as viewing the containers as though they were machines by running something like docker compose exec, which is for executing a command in there. So we can use -it for interactive terminal inside a service. So for our case, we want to run our app service or our Django app service. That's how I called it. Then we want to run maybe a bash terminal inside there. So this will open up our bash terminal inside the Django app. So for this case, if we run ls, we are now inside our /app folder. So this is the files we've created inside our container. So we can be in position to run some commands in there. For example, if we did /manage.py shell, we can run. So we actually do not have Python in here. but rather we can maybe use Python 3 as the command. So we run Python 3 manage.py shell. We can then have that Python shell for our Django application running, but inside the containers file system, which is interesting. So that means we can also exit out of that and still do the same thing for our database. So this time we can do docker-compose exec, and then we can run our -it. So for our case, we want to run the DB service, but we want to run PostgreSQL. We can specify our user to be the user we created in our environment variables, and the database we want to connect to as our test database. Let me just verify the spelling of that, which is test database. So if we run that, we shall be inside our PostgreSQL shell, and since we do not have any tables, we cannot find any relations, so that means that we are good to go. Now, one other thing we can do is to maybe verify if our database is connected to successfully because of our environment variables we set up for our app. So to do that, we can run manage or Python 3 manage.py, and for this case I'll run db shell, and if I see something that has to do with PSQL, then I'll understand that I am currently connected to my PostgreSQL database. So that means I can also do something like Python 3 manage.py migrate, and I'll have all the default tables created within our database. So if that command runs successfully, so db address associated with the host name, so under why this is not happening, but what's supposed to happen is our database tables have to be created inside there. So after some investigation, one thing I realized that I did not specify the network for that DB. So it's always important that we make those run within the same network. So if I specify app network to be the network in which our app will run, I then have to also specify that within our database, something that I forgot. What a silly mistake. So I'll just go right here and define networks, and then I'll add the app-network. So I'll save, and that will be it. So then I'll have to rebuild the whole setup. So I'll stop my containers with Ctrl+C, and if I do something like docker-compose, I'll do -help. I need a command that is going to help me to sort of like build the entire thing. So run compose try run. Oh, let me just actually run docker compose app help. So what I'm interested in is build. So build images before starting containers. So if I run docker compose app --build, that will build our containers and then implement that change we've done to add the network. So our PostgreSQL service will start, our server will start running, and this time if we try to access that database or try to execute our migrations, we can do that with Python 3 manage.py migrate. And since they are in the same service or same network, then our migrations will be applied, meaning that our tables now exist. So if we try to go back to our PostgreSQL shell and list our databases, this time our tables will be created. So that is just nice. We've been able to finally set up these tables or set up the Django tables inside our containers. So we have two services. We have the Django app as well as the PostgreSQL service. Now, one thing we need to do is to also go ahead and create a super user, and I'm going to do that inside our Django container. And we do something like Python 3 manage.py create super user. I think I've made a mistake, so that's create super user. So I'm going to keep my name to that, my email address to, let me just add a test email address, test user at Django app.com, and then the password is going to be my simple password here, and then I'll add the password here. Then our superuser will be created successfully. So if we try to exit out of that and maybe run our container, go to our browser right here, we shall see that our server is still running. That response is being returned the same way it was being returned initially. So yeah, we've been able to set that up. Now to verify whether our admin is working, I'll then go to the /admin route, and that will take us to the admin dashboard. So one thing to note here is that our static files are not being served, but just in case I was to log in, let me see, with that and my password, I'll then log in and I'll be taken to the Django admin. So yeah, to set up our static files, we're going to be making use of a tool called white noise. So we can go ahead and find that with white noise Django, and that will lead us to the website where we can use it. So we first need to install it and add it to our requirements. So I need to go right here and say pip install white noise. So that will go ahead and install white noise, but we also need to go ahead and freeze it to our requirements, so txt, and then we need to go ahead and rebuild everything. But before we do that, we shall add some stuff to our settings.py. So right here on their website, they give a detail on how to set everything up. Let me make this be in a theme you can all see. So the first thing we need to set up is the static folder where our static files are going to be for our app in production when our debug is false. So for now, we can see our static root is base-static files. So I'm going to copy that, and then we can come to our settings.py. At the bottom, this side is where I can set all that up. I can introduce our static files settings, and then I will add the static root will be base-static file. So this is like the directory in which Django will look for all the compiled static files for this project. Then we need to specify the static URL. So our static URL is going to be, I think this is already defined here. So let me just actually move all this here. So we shall have our static URL being the static URL, and then we have the static root, which will be the folder that contain our static files. So static URL will be the URL on which we shall access all the static files that will be kept in the static files directory. Then after doing that, we need to go ahead and enable white noise. So the first thing we need to do is to go and add this in our middleware under the security middleware. So we need to find that still inside our settings.py right here, right under the Django middleware or the security middleware. That's where we shall add our white noise. So yeah, after adding that, we can also add compressing and caching support. So we can add this to our static files, but since we do not have any of that in need, we can at least leave it to that. So yeah, just like that, we've been able to set up our white noise. So what we're going to do is to run our containers again, our services, and this time we can run docker-compose app build. So that will start our 2 containers. So now what we need to do is to go inside our container for our app. And what we shall run is python 3 manage.py. And in this case, we need to run collect static. So what this will do, it will collect all static files for our app, put them in a central folder, and then Django will be in position to serve them like we have set up in our settings.py file. So 127 static files have been copied to app static files. So that means we can then access those files. If I'm to go back right here and go back to our admin, this time we shall see that our Django styles have been applied. And if I try to log in with our created user setup, this time we can see that my Django admin panel is working, so we can pretty much do anything we want with our Django admin. Okay, so at this point we've set up an environment for our Django application. We've run it with Gunicorn, and we've also introduced PostgreSQL. So everything that we currently have is running on our PostgreSQL database, including the user that we currently have. So now it's time we set up Redis.